Good evening and welcome to Philly Live. I'm Ashok Gangadine, your global connection. Tonight, progressive Muslims. Ever since 9/11, most Americans have had a shocking encounter with Islam and the Muslim world. Many may associate Islam with terrorism and with what seems to be a militant religion, which is at war with the West. At the same time, many recognize that this major world religion, which is in fact a religion originating from the Bible, the common source of Judaism and Christianity, share the same values. It is not more widely seen that Islam may have been in some way hijacked by extremist groups, and that the vast majority of Muslims are moderate and are committed to peace, equality, and justice. So why don't we hear more from this substantial majority? Are there progressive Muslims? What questions do you have about the Muslim faith? We're fortunate tonight to have with us two practicing Muslims who are also accomplished scholars and teachers in the field. Dr. Omid Safi just edited a book, Progressive Muslims on Justice, Gender, and Pluralism. Omid is a professor of religion and philosophy at Colgate University. And our second guest is his colleague, Dr. Scott Kugle, who's also participated in this volume. Scott is a professor of religion at Swarthmore College. And in fact, Omid just delivered a lecture at Swarthmore this afternoon. Omid and Scott, welcome to Philly Live.
Thank you. It's great
to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
Help us get started with understanding what is a progressive Muslim. Omid, would you help us with that, please?
Sure. It's in fact a fairly simple idea. It's when one starts as a Muslim and as a human being with the conviction that every single human life all over this planet, no matter if they are Muslim or non-Muslim, male or female, has exactly the same value. And that value is because every human being is endued with divine spirit, as the Quran and the Bible both teach us.
Right. So that's really at the heart of Islam in the classic way.
Absolutely.
It's going to be called. Scott, what does it mean to you to be a progressive?
I think of it as being a radical monotheist. That it's not just somebody who believes in one God, but somebody who acts radically on that belief. Again, by asserting that everybody was created equally by God, endowed with the same faculties of intelligence, the same faculties of spiritual potential. That's the image of God breathing spirit into the body of the human being.
And that really seems deeply akin to Christianity and Judaism, that kind of outlook.
Yeah, I think it's one reason why you tend to have such wonderful conversations and cooperations among progressives from the Muslim, the Jewish, and the Christian context, which is that they don't just share the same faith in the presence of God and all of humanity, but they act on it. Right. And they try to bring about a sense of transformation inside themselves and in the society around them.
Now, given the images we have in the press and so forth, it's hard to get a sense of who are progressive Muslims. Scott, could you take that for us? Are there many, or how extensive is that group?
I would say in general there are many more Muslims who think progressively than who adopt that label self-consciously. As a self-conscious label, it's fairly new.
Right.
But in a way, Islam, especially the Quran, espouses values that contemporary people would think of as progressive. The values of gender equality, the values of equality of all races or all ethnicities. Those are things that a lot of people think of as very modern inventions, but in fact Muslims have been finding the voice of the Quran to speak about these issues. So many people may have progressive ideas but not adopt progressive as a label.
Right.
It's really only after the events of 9/11 that a body of people have started to maybe embrace this label progressive in a more systematic way.
Right. Well, I'm just going to invite our friends at home to pick up the phone and call in tonight and join this conversation. We're talking about progressive Muslims, and there's a movement like that going on, and both Omid and Scott here will help us understand that and take your questions. So please pick up the phone and call. Our lines are open. Omid, take that further for us in terms of the numbers. So someone could be, in fact, progressive Muslim and not label herself, himself that?
Oh, sure. Just as I think there are many people who may think of themselves as Christian and work to alleviate the suffering of their fellow human beings and simply think of it as an act of charity, an act of love, a form of service, without feeling the need to necessarily put a label on themselves. But I think in the time and age that we live in, there is some utility to a label which can serve as an invitation. It's a sign to both Muslims who are committed to these ideas of justice and gender equality, and also to non-Muslims, that we are here, that we have a community, and that you can reach out to us, we can reach out to you, and it's a way of creating a safe space in which these types of conversations can take place.
Right, so Scott, in your judgment, in terms of the wide, vast, diverse Muslim world, how many people might fall into that category of being more progressive? Or we hear the word moderate. And we often hear that there's a vast majority of moderates. Is moderate the same as progressive?
I don't think that they're quite the same thing. Moderate, of course, means moderate when compared to what? Moderate doesn't have anything intrinsic about it that would characterize
It's a relative term, obviously, yeah.
Yeah. So is it, we're talking about moderate Muslims being those Muslims, say, who cooperate with the UN, who cooperate with the American government, who are not extremist. All those things are kind of comparing moderate Muslims to something else.
Right.
Whereas progressive Muslims, I think, identify with a certain set of ideals, a certain set of practices. So it's much more intrinsic. It's not a label that's comparing them to somebody else.
Right. So go ahead.
In that way, it's hard then to give a head count.
Yeah, and there is something radical. I mean, that word gets abused a lot. But there is something radical about this notion of a commitment to the humanity of us all, and an imperative to stop the suffering of human beings, no matter where on earth they live. That's not a moderate notion. In this day and age, that's actually a radical commitment of love and transformation that one is talking about. But perhaps it's a radical in the sense of the highest ideals that one can.
So why is this kind of pervasive public image of a kind of militant dimension to Islam that dominates our news? It seems to be out of sync with what you're describing as the heart of Islam.
I think there's a number of reasons for it. One of them is that we live in an age in which the Soviet Union, as the Red Menace, has fallen, and rather than wanting to rise to a higher level of consciousness where we as Americans begin to identify with the full of humanity, we're looking for the next enemy that we can plug into that vacuum. And so for many people, Islam, or the Green Menace, is now taking place of the big bad scary communists. I think as Muslims, we also have a responsibility to allow these kinds of voices to be heard more clearly and more frequently. So I think that there's responsibility on all sides.
Jackie from West Philadelphia is here with us. Hi, Jackie.
Hi.
Welcome to Philly Live.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the gentleman a question. I hear when you're trying to distinguish between the moderate, I guess, and the conservatism, or the so-called traditional. I'd like to know, as a moderate, do you also, I heard you say something about women being having equality. Do you allow women as a moderate to be leaders of your church? Do you allow women and men to worship together, or is it still separate? You know, as a Christian and as a layman, I mean no insult by that, but what is distinguishing you between the traditional Muslims and you as being a moderate or moderate Muslim?
Thank you, Jackie, very much. A thoughtful question. And we've had guests on the show before, who talked about, violence to women and honor killings and the position of women in Afghanistan. So there's a kind of image about women not having equality. Right. So I guess the question is really pressing on that. Scott, do you want to try that for us?
Well, of course, in any situation of civil war and civil strife, it's always women and children who are victimized the most. So when we talk about Afghanistan, we have to realize that that's a situation where there's been a civil war for the past 30 years. It's not a normal situation under any circumstances. But when we talk about leadership positions in a church, of course, there are no churches in Islam. There are mosques.
Yes.
There are mosque communities that handle the issue of gender segregation differently. And then one has to raise the question of whether gender segregation implies or actualizes gender inequality. And different mosques handle this in different ways depending on the local community consensus. But in general, most mosques are gender segregated as a worship space, but men and women have equal footing as worshipers in front of God.
Right, and is that grounded in the Quran itself, the justification?
I think for many of us it is. For many of us, it's we go back to passages in the Quran that discuss the notion that God has created all of humanity from the same soul, that in a way that Adam and Eve are both derived from the same singular soul, nafsan wahidatan, as the Quran calls it. And there's not this notion of Eve being a secondary derivation from Adam's rib or a crooked rib. And for many progressive Muslims, those types of notions of equal creation, equal moral responsibility and accountability before God, those are things that we take very seriously. And I'd like to point out that the participants in this particular book that we are talking about today are, half of them are male, half of them are female, and that's no accident.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, Lewis from Northeast Philadelphia is with us. Hi, Lewis.
Hello.
Welcome to Philly Live.
Thank you.
Your question?
Okay, I have a small two-part question. First of all, I'm originally from New York City, from Brooklyn. My brother works in a hardware store. He's a manager in a hardware store. He works for a Hasid, which is an ultra-Orthodox Jew. One of the workers there is a Muslim, and he gets along really well with my brother. My brother is not a Muslim. I don't want to get into my brother's religion and whatnot. But one time he tells my brother, he tells him, Tony, you're my friend. I like you a lot. The time is going to come when we are going to have a war with the Christians and with the Jews. And I don't want to have to kill you. You should convert to Islam. I like you a lot. You know, I don't want to have to do that to you, so you should convert to Islam.
Thank you.
And also my second part was with the word, concerning the word kuffar. Like, I've heard certain Muslims use the word kuffar as unbelievers and whatnot. So anyone who's not a Muslim can be treated a certain way. They don't have to be respected because they're just kuffar. And I've heard other Muslims say, I've heard a couple of Muslims say that that's not the way the word is used, because originally Muhammad just meant that as the unbelievers, because they were Muslims. I mean,
thank you, Lewis.
Christians that
Thank you so much. Very interesting two-part question. And would you like to feel it?
Why don't you address the first part?
Sure.
First part had to do with the three, the friends, but there's going to be a war.
Right.
And then the kuffar.
I think when one goes back and looks at the Quran, one can look at, for those who like chapter and verses, chapter 2, verse 62 of the Quran, which talk about those who are Muslim, those who are Christian, those who are Jewish. Anyone who has faith in God and the last day and does righteous deeds, on them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve. And I think there's a notion in which being a progressive Muslim is not about converting everyone to Islam. The Quran states that there can be no compulsion in religion. I think it's rather a matter of trying to make Muslims the best and most ethically grounded Muslims possible, and to also provide an example of love, service, and justice for Christians and Jews that one is in contact with. So one moves from that paradigm of coerced conversion and to a model of pluralism when one is engaging one another through one's differences.
Right. You want to pick up on the second part?
Sure. One thing that progressive Muslims do is to kind of sift through the tradition as we've received it and to pick what's best, what's a noble example. And Islam has a lot of resources for a pluralistic understanding of religious belief. There's a separate word for people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab, Christians, Jews, people who have received scripture, who are held in great esteem as people on an equal footing with Muslims before God. The word kuffar in Arabic means somebody who turns their back on the truth, literally. And it was, in the time of the Prophet, a word used to describe the Arabs in the Prophet's immediate environment who repudiated him and repudiated all revealed religions. So it's really not accurate to use the word kuffar and ascribe it or describe with it Jews or Christians or people who have a scriptural text. That's not a very Islamic position to take.
All right, just to encourage our viewers to pick up the phone. Our lines are open. We'd love to hear from you tonight. Join our conversation. We're talking about progressive Muslims, and any question you may have for our two very articulate guests on the Muslim world and the Muslim faith, we'd love to hear from you. Now, Omid, one of the questions in terms of the polarities is the tradition and the modern, and locating between that, and whether there are resources in the Muslim world and Islam to transpose into the 21st century. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, Muslims are already here. And to the extent that Islam is something that is embodied in the lived realities of Muslims, it's already present in the 21st century. In terms of engaging tradition and modernity, I think one of the great resources that exists in Islam is the concept of ijtihad, which is the notion of thoughtful, critical engagement to arrive at contemporary answers. And this is a well-established practice within Islamic thought, within Islamic law, and there's this notion that it is the imperative of the Muslim thinker to engage in it.
So critical thinking is part of the faith itself?
It's been articulated as such for a very, very long time.
Right.
And it's one of the ideas that contemporary progressive Muslims tap into as this is our religious contribution.
Right. I'm going to pick up on the point, Scott, you might help us with this on modernity and modernism and so forth, and how what progressive Muslims might relate to that. But now Shelley from Center City is with us. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome.
I would like to know, please, is anyone in charge of the faith as the Pope is for the Catholics?
If there anyone in charge, thank you so much, Sherry. Anything like a pope or a presiding figure in the Islamic faith?
Not like the Pope, perhaps, but God.
God is the presiding figure. That's a good answer.
But Muslims don't give up that prerogative to any human being.
Single being.
I see. Yeah. So there's no office, so to speak, in the faith that holds this kind of commanding.
Which creates a more fluid, loose situation, and it creates for more possibilities of people coming up with their own interpretation and practice of the faith. And it's one of the opportunities that is created for us as people that have these kinds of commitments to justice and pluralism to come up with our own contribution.
Right. Now, to walk a fine line, Scott, between the tradition and entering the modern period, there are many ills with modernism and the modern. How does a progressive view the modern situation?
Well, progressives have kind of a double vision, you could say, looking back to their own tradition to find what's useful, ethical, inspiring, and also looking at the modern world to find what's useful, practical, and just. But there are so many things about the modern world that are unjust. Environmental degradation, the results of our economic system, a rampant and increasing poverty in the world. So progressive Muslims are not beguiled by modernism. They don't want to reform Islam to fit into the modern world, without also trying to reform the modern world to fit in with a more ethical and just vision of a pluralistic world that can be shared with everybody. Right. Not just the one-thirds world.
That's a wonderful vision, you know, and it sounds like being a global citizen, use other language. Is that really seeded in the heart of Islam, that kind of capacity to take on that outlook in
Within
the
the context of the Quran, there's an imperative to transcend notions of tribes and nations even. And there's a sense of identifying with the whole of humanity with whom God has established a covenant. And it's that humanity that the Quran refers to as children of Adam.
I see.
And it's that sense of even conceiving of a level of humanity beyond merely the 1 billion or so Muslims. And in that regard, there are also many statements from the Prophet Muhammad that talk about one is not a real believer if one does not feel the pain and empathy of others.
All right. Now, Denise from South Philly is here. Hi, Denise.
Hi.
Welcome.
How you doing?
Your question?
I wanted to know, could a Muslim man marry a Christian woman?
Thank you
or
very
vice
much.
versa?
Thank you.
I think I did that, actually.
There's a living example.
Exactly. My wife is Catholic.
Oh, really?
We have 3 children together, and we had a lovely wedding ceremony held at the Duke Chapel, in which we read from verses from the Quran, as well as the Song of Songs, and things of that sort. So yes, I can speak.
That's certainly not a unique situation. Right. It's an enshrined principle in Islamic law that a Muslim man can marry a Jewish or a Christian woman.
Really?
Any woman who comes from a community of the people of the book, people who have a revealed scripture.
Right.
And the Prophet Muhammad was the one who instituted this institution.
Right. But in terms of what you're saying about the global, the humanity and a global outlook, you would think that you might have married a Buddhist or a Hindu even, not only within the book.
I happened to fall in love with somebody who was Catholic, so this was my fate.
I see.
Yeah.
But certainly this notion of who are the people of the book has been expanded in Islamic cultures as Muslims have engaged with Buddhists and Hindus throughout Asia.
Right.
And most deep Muslim thinkers in India have recognized Hindus and Buddhists as also people of the book because they have a scriptural text that they go back to for their religious ideas and their ethical precepts.
Right. Now, yes, go ahead.
And I think it's also important to realize that when we talk about pluralism in this concept, it's not merely an intellectual exercise, but there are very concrete ways in which it gets manifested, such as intermarriage, such as sharing meals. And I think that these are all, it's much more easy to love someone when you have broken bread with them.
Right.
And it's certainly pretty much impossible to hate an entire block of humanity if they're married into your family.
Right.
And I think given these traditions of practical pluralism in Muslim history, these are very important resources for us to keep in mind.
And the Quran tells the stories of the prophets, often the same prophets that the Bible talks about. And in Abraham, who we call Ibrahim in the Quran, there's a story, he gives an example of somebody's generosity, of inviting people to eat with him, people who were strangers, people who were not part of his family or tribe or nation. So Muslims go back to the resources of the Prophet to draw out these ethical principles, which are then very applicable in daily life.
I'm beginning to hear two sides. What does it mean to be a Muslim identity within the Muslim world, and the other beyond the borders on a global scale? But now Richard from West Philadelphia is with us. Hi, Richard. Welcome.
Hi, how are you? I would like to follow up on an earlier question. I have met Muslim women in this country and in Indonesia who are graduate students studying feminism and the Muslim faith.
Right.
And I'd like to know what your two panelists know about this and whether this is a new area of concern for women or whether it has a long tradition.
Thank you so much, Richard. Scott, would you feel that for us in terms of...
Well, there's about as long a tradition of feminist thought and practice in the Muslim world as there is in the Western Christian world. If we go back to Egypt, feminist thinking goes back to the early 1900s. So it's not a new idea or a new practice. It is certainly something that has taken off, let's say, in the last 20, 30 years. And there are now many Muslim women in the Islamic world who see themselves as feminists or womanists.
Right.
The greatest example being Shireen Ebadi, who was recently given the Nobel Peace Prize, and she's a woman lawyer, an activist for human rights, children's rights, and women's rights in Iran. Somebody who perhaps not many folks in the United States were aware of before she was given the Nobel Peace Prize just a few weeks ago.
Right. And Dr. Rifat Hassan has been on the show, and she's clearly in that. Ronald from West Oak Lane is with us. Hi, Ronald.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome.
Yes, I wanted to make two comments, actually. First, on the 9/11 event. I wanted to say that I think that people in general need to point the finger at the individual or the individuals who actually committed the act, not at those who are of the same religion or the same race. The other thing about it is I think that God has a plan for everybody as far as religions are concerned, because he realizes that everybody is different because he actually created everybody. So as a result, I feel that people need to learn to accept each other for who they are and not be judgmental.
Right.
And that if they do that, this world would definitely be a much better place to be.
Thank you so much, Ronald, very much for that. And that sounds like a very progressive attitude of Ronald's last remark about reaching out to all people in a kind of equality.
Yeah.
He would be a wonderful dialogue partner to have.
Yes, he would.
Right. So picking up on the point earlier about the tensions within the Muslim world, trying to articulate one's identity in this new way, that creates a lot of inner flack within the Muslim community, doesn't it? Could you talk about that? I see two faces, within the Muslim world and then the reaching out beyond to the world at large, other faiths, other cultures, and so forth.
Well, this is a definite tension because in the current situation, when there is so much criticism against Islam at large, coming from government circles, from just the popular culture, the perception that Islam is somehow to blame for 9/11, rather than, as the last caller said, it was a certain individual or a certain group.
Right. That
creates pressures on Muslims maybe not to speak up about some of the injustices that happen within our own communities because we want to put a good face on for the rest of the world.
Right.
So progressive Muslims have a kind of a double challenge to speak to people in our own communities about our own problems, and then also to reach out and speak to the wider world of modernity and talk about the wider problems that we all share.
Right.
You know, sometimes people have talked to us about you are talking so explicitly about class tensions and the problems of women and the oppression of minorities in our communities. Why are you airing out our dirty laundry? And I guess what we would like people to think is that it's not about airing out dirty laundry. You got to wash the thing.
Right.
If you got dirty laundry, at some point it needs to be washed so you can have clean clothes. And for us, it's a matter of we want to live in ethically just, pluralistic communities in which the dignity of all human beings are acknowledged and engaged.
Right. I noticed. Just go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, and it really seems to be the divisions along the line of gender inequality and maybe issues of sexual morality, where Muslim communities get very, very concerned that maybe progressive voices are speaking too much to a wider audience. Issues of gay rights or lesbian rights or women's rights. Those are very, very touchy topics, but ones that the progressive Muslim group feels need to be addressed.
Now, given the extent of injustices and inequalities and gender issues in the world at large, a progressive Muslim cannot be, I think there's a remark in your book that to say Islam is a religion of peace is a kind of mantra that you get annoyed with. Could you talk about that? We just have about 1 minute left to...
In the sense that our task is not ultimately to save Islam or to save God. God has always been eternal and majestic and just fine, and Islam is fine. What is in need of help and rescuing and alliances are human beings who are suffering and are oppressed all over the world, and it's that message that we have to bring, that we stand up for human beings, Muslim and non-Muslim, and it's that idea that we've tried to bring out in this book.
It's a wonderful book. I really recommend it. If people just very quickly wanted to learn some more, 15 seconds, how can they learn more? Is there a site or...
Is there a website? Well, one is to simply read the Quran. The Quran says God commands you to act justly and to bring beauty or goodness into the world.
Omid and Scott, thank you so much. Time is just about up. Thank you. And thank you for your wonderful questions and for watching Philly Live. And for more information on tonight's topic and all of our programs, log on to our website at wybe.org. And tomorrow night on your Lesbian Gay Connection with Deborah D'Alessandro, pioneering lesbian and gay plays. And I'll return next week to discuss Genesis meditations. For Philly Live, I'm Ashok Angudin. Have a great evening. Good night.